Hello and welcome back to our little brief sort of philosophical interlude after the Ottoman Empire and before we get into British empires and then the revolutions, French Revolution, American Revolution, covering some thinkers that sort of represent the Enlightenment and sort of the revolution in thinking and in philosophy that in many ways the political revolutions. And so today we're talking about two English people, John Locke and Mary Wollstonecraft. Locke is a bit older than her. He's sort of like beginning of the 1700s. Wollstonecraft is sort of the end of the 1700s. But both talking about sort of basic human rights, which is not sort of thing that has really been addressed yet in this course. Wollstonecraft sort of extending those rights very early on, long before, you know, the 20s and then the 70s, and at least in the US, where women actually got something resembling. So Locke was English. He was a Protestant. Remember this is the era of you know constant strife between Protestants and Catholics. So he was Protestant. He lived sort of late 1600s, early 1700s. Brilliant guy, polymath. He was trained in medicine, worked as a physician, but also wrote extensively in philosophy. He's still discussed in philosophy of mind and in political philosophy. Um, his philosophical approach was that he was an empiricist, which contrasts with Descartes, who we spoke about in the last lecture. Descartes was a rationalist who thought you can only really know things through reasoning and logic. Locke thought, no, you're born with more or less a blank slate in your mind, and any information you have, any thoughts, any ideas, any knowledge comes in through the senses. His political philosophy, which we'll be discussing, is contained in his two treatises of government, and you just read a few passages from that book. So Locke wants to talk about sort of by what authority um, humans can be sort of forced to do anything against their will, right? So have we find ourselves in this situation where we're all sort of members, citizens, or otherwise of a state. There are people in power that have authority over us, authority of life and death in some cases. Um, Locke wants to investigate where that authority might come from. He starts out by saying, well, it can't be a divine mandate, right? Or it can't be inheritance through God. We've seen some emperors have claimed, right, that they're chosen by God or somehow are a god. So Locke's working within a Christian tradition, right? He says, look, there's nothing in the Bible that's God giving any human, like for example, Adam, who would have been the first human, any authority over any other humans, apart from maybe his children, right? And even if that was sort of implicitly the case, uh, we don't have any record of like the line of succession of that authority from Adam. Like if Adam was sort of the king of humanity, just in virtue of being first, then was his eldest son then the next king, and so on. Um, Even if that were the case, we have no record of it. So any of our current rulers can't claim that they are sort of in that line of succession from um, technically, according to the Bible, we're all descended from Adam. The idea is there are multiple sons, and as it branches, there would have to be one line of succession, right? And the ruler would have to claim to be in that line. There's no way that could be known or proven. Another possibility is that whatever authority a ruler happens to have um, is just taken by violence, and it's just strongest wins, right? Um, Maybe, but in that case, Locke says, okay, then basically human society is not really any different from wolf society or ape society. Um, Meanest and the biggest and the strongest takes what they can, right? And I don't know, I might sometimes be inclined to say, yeah, that's exactly how it works. But Locke dismisses that, right? And he says, no, he has another account of how political authority comes about. So to begin with, Locke distinguishes the sort of power that he wants to talk about, political power, um, as the sort of power a ruler has over his or her subjects. Um, this is contrasted with the sorts of power that, for example, a father has over his children, the power of a master has over a servant or over a slave, and in typically sexist language, the authority a husband has over his wife, right? Um, in contrast to these, political power he defines as the right to inflict death, right? And in virtue of that power to inflict death, therefore to inflict any punishment below that, right? Because ultimately, if I say okay, I have the authority to put you in prison for 2 years, implicit behind that is if you refuse and if you fight me and you keep fighting me, I will kill you, right? Um, so political power is that authority, right, of life and death over people. And in virtue of that life and death authority, the authority to do other things like lock them up. But all of that can only be in the service of the public good, right? It's not an absolute power. Um, and that's quite different, right, from the way political power has been understood by many of the emperors that we've studied. Right? In those cases, it was absolute political power. Right? Often the emperors could, yeah, kill whoever they wanted, whether or not it was in the service of the public good. So Locke talks about a state of nature, right? And he says this is the original state of humans before there were any countries, right, before there were any states. Um, he's sort of implicitly borrowing from Thomas Hobbes, who also describes a state of nature. But they both approach it quite differently. So this is sort of a mythical state. No one knows, right, what it was like because all of the records we have, the earliest records we have, are like from Sumerians who were a civilization. We don't have any direct evidence of humans before there were governments, right? Um, but nonetheless, he thinks that that state was one of perfect freedom and equality. Now, he doesn't mean that it was a perfect situation and then there was never any violence or anything, but he means in terms of um, your freedoms, you were free to do whatever you wanted to do. You were not constrained by any laws or anything like that. Um, he also thinks that humans were basically equal. And he quotes another author, Hooker, who claims that this quality is just self-evident. It's not immediately self-evident. It would have been helpful if Locke had given us a little more explanation of what he means by this equality. Because obviously, some humans are stronger than others, some humans are smarter than others, so not every human is completely equal to every other human. Now, Hobbes has his own approach to this question of equality. And Hobbes concedes that, yeah, you know, given human can be stronger than another, but we're like roughly equal. Like we're equal enough that even if one other human is like especially strong, two or three of us could get together and take him down, right? Um, So we're equal enough that no one person is just in a totally different superior class from all other humans. Maybe that's what Locke means. I don't know, he might mean something slightly different. Uh, Locke, as with all of these uh, early modern thinkers, are often difficult to but at any rate, we'll move on. Uh, so he seems to think, right, that our freedom in the state of nature is only limited by what he calls the law of nature. And the law of nature includes the laws of reason. Um, so laws of logic and things like that, in addition, right? Um, and he thinks that anyone who's reasonable will come to the conclusion that it is wrong to harm another human, as each human is created by God, right? So apparently anyone who's rational would also come to the conclusion that God exists. This was a common belief among, thinkers from Thomas Aquinas on to even Descartes offers some proofs of the existence of God. Um, so this premise, right, is that since everyone was created by God, then it's going to be obvious that harming other humans is wrong. I, Nowadays, not everyone is going to accept that because they're not going to accept that God exists, and they're not going to necessarily accept that harming is wrong, right? Um, but back over to Hobbes, right? Hobbes doesn't use the God approach. Hobbes says, look, the reason we don't kill each other is not because we all innately know it's wrong. The reason we don't kill each other is because we realize that we don't want to have to sleep with one eye open every night, wondering if we're going to be killed, right? And so we all get together, we form a contract, and we agree. Hey, let's all agree. I won't kill you. You don't kill me, and now we can both get some sleep and maybe get something done in our lives. Right? So that's Hobbes' approach. Locke has a different approach. He seems to think that it's just self-evident from the start that you don't kill another human and don't harm them. If that's the case, then he thinks that each of us also has a natural right to punish people who do violate that. So obviously he knows that people do kill other people, right? That since it's self-evident that that's wrong, that gives us a right to punish that person, right? Um, so yeah, if someone harms you, right? If someone violates your rights, your freedom, right? So basically, each of us has the freedom to do whatever they want as long as they don't harm somebody else, right? That's the state of nature. If you do harm someone else, either by taking their property or harming them bodily or something else, then they have the right to reparations, right? They can take that thing back from you. They can harm you in the same way, whatever. But there is a limit to it. You can't just do anything you want to a criminal, right? If someone steals your bike, you don't get to kill them, right? The response has to be in some way proportionate. At any rate, he thinks that these things are basic, right? You don't need a government to make this the case. You don't need a king or an emperor to give you these rights. We're born with these rights to freedom, so long as you're not hurting anybody. And you're born with the right that if somebody hurts you, you can revenge or pursue justice. So all these rights, right? Perfect liberty except to harm one another and the right to punish criminals. These exist before any state or any government exists. They come from the law of nature. As evidence for this fact, Locke cites like Locke points out that if a foreigner who is not right part of your government, not sort of agreed to your social contract, comes to your country and commits a crime, you're allowed to punish them, right? Um, how is that, right? They're not, in some sense, they shouldn't be subject to your laws. And Locke says, yeah, they're not, but you're not really punishing them based on your laws. You're punishing them based on your natural right to punish. Um, So then whatever rights a ruler or a government or a state has to punish derives from the more basic right of each person to punish when they've been harmed. Um, the idea is the criminal in violating the law of nature, which includes the laws of reason, right, which it's self-evident to him or her that harming others is wrong. When they do that, they've shown themselves to be irrational, and therefore they've shown themselves to be no better than an animal, and therefore may be treated as an animal. Um, So he says there's a limit on how harsh the punishment can be. Right? If someone steals your bike, you shouldn't kill them. So what is the limit? What is the proportionality? Locke says the punishment should be only just barely so severe that it makes committing the crime a losing bargain. Right? Um, so if I know that if I get caught stealing this bike, that the punishment is going to be worse than if I'd never stolen the bike in the first place, right? Never tried, then I'll refuse to do it. If the punishment is just, they take the bike back and nothing worse happens to me, that would kind of make it a good bet to just steal as many bikes as I can. Worst case, they just take the bike back. The punishment's got be a little harsher than that. Okay, so why do we need a government to do the punishing, right? If each one of us has a right to punish wrongdoers, why don't we just keep it like that? Well, Locke says people are not perfect, right? So if you've been wronged, you're going to tend to be in a state of rage or jealousy or anger, right? And your punishment is going to be probably too harsh, disproportionate. Maybe you'll be inclined to punish even when punishment is not deserved, right? Say someone, whatever, someone steals your girlfriend, that's not really a punishable offense, right? If she chose to go, date someone else instead, but you're going to feel like you want to punish somebody. So we kind of take that power out of people and put it in the government because the government can punish more consistently, right, than nature will allow. Um, Notice that according to Locke's system, kings shouldn't be in the punishing business either, right? Because kings are humans, they're fallible, they're also subject to jealousy and rage, right? So a king can be make the same mistake, right? The king gets jealous of somebody or feels slighted by somebody and will be inclined to punish them even when it's unjust, right? So, and it's even worse really in the case of the monarch, because if a monarch punishes unjustly and thus does a harm that deserves punishment, no one can punish the monarch. So really, kings shouldn't be the source of law, right? It should be in, should be in some sort of like a Congress or something like that. So from here on out, Locke considers like a few objections to his account, right? Um, one point is like the state of nature you described. We have no evidence that it ever actually existed. It's kind of a myth, right? So, um, as far as we know, back in history, like there's been some form of government, right? The earliest records we have are Sumerians, and yeah, surely there were, cave people at some point, but who knows what sort of organization they had. They were really in the state of nature. And Locke says you don't have to look back into prehistory to figure out if there was ever a state of nature. Um, Rulers of states are currently in the state of nature, right? They're not really beholden to laws, more so in Locke's time, right? But you take a figure like Putin, I think, who at this point is like, I mean, there's nominally laws in Russia, but he can pretty much do whatever he wants, right, within his own country. And so when he's, going to war with Ukraine, right, he and Zelensky are in a state of nature, right? They're heads of government that really have no perfect freedom and no real constraints on themselves, right? And and they're interacting with another in a state of nature. Um, so he says, really, we're all still in a state of nature, right? We do have perfect freedom. The freedoms that we don't have, we have willingly relinquished, right, for the benefits of living in a community. So when we get together and form a government, right, it's because we think it will be to our mutual benefit, and therefore I relinquish my perfect freedom to drive as fast as I want, as long as I don't crash into somebody, right? Um, to shoot as much heroin as I want, as long as I'm not hurting anybody. We give up some of those rights, some of those freedoms, because we think it'll be better on the whole for us, right? But it's voluntary choice, he thinks, right? Now, of course, each of us is born into a with certain laws. We don't really choose it. It's not exactly easy to just leave the country and go to another country if you like that country better, right? That takes money and stuff. So in practice, did we all really freely give up our rights and choose here? Right? At least that's the idea, Locke's idea. So, yeah, so each human is by nature free, can only relinquish that freedom by their consent, to get some benefit out of it, of a community, or you can relinquish that freedom by engaging in criminal acts, by harming other people, right? Which he described as a kind of consent. It's giving up your reason, right, and becoming non-human in a way, right? It's more animalistic. So, given that, right, to take someone else's freedom is against nature, right? It's an unnatural act. So you can imagine what Locke would say about slavery, right? For inherently wrong, right? People are born with freedoms, and to enslave someone and take all their freedom without their consent would never be right for Locke. Right? So Locke had a big influence on the United States, on the founders of the United States. Not enough influence that they gave up on slavery right away, right? But there are definitely bits of Locke sprinkled throughout the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, right? So we have Locke claims that humans have the natural right to life, liberty, and property. It shows up in the Declaration of Independence as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right, instead of property. But um, it comes from Locke, right? Also, right, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Right? If you paid attention to this lecture, that's exactly what Locke is arguing, right? So much was borrowed from Locke and at the founding of the advocated the separation of the powers of legislative, executive, and judicial branches, which is exactly what we did in the Constitution. So definitely the founders of the United States, they'd read Locke, they found Locke appealing, and incorporated many of his views into All right, now moving on a little bit later, Mary Wollstonecraft um, sort of applies some of Locke's, if you read Locke, uh, there's nothing about his reasoning that would seem to suggest that, oh, but none of this counts for women, right? Somehow we're all born with perfect freedom, but only men. Um, it, he's not very explicit about it, right? But there's nothing about his reasoning that would seem to preclude women from being included in this. And this is sort of Wollstonecraft's takes the obvious next step and says, look, hey, all this should apply to women as well, right? So Wollstonecraft lived in the later 1700s. Um, her home life was pretty rotten. Her father was fairly abusive and was bad with money, and it was kind of a rotten home. Um, Unfortunately, she had a friend whose father was a professor, and she would sit in on lectures and spend a lot of time at her friend's house, and sort of was able to get more education than the average woman girl at the time, right? And sort of develop her intellect. So she was very bright, but locked into the role of a woman without a lot of money in that society, right? So she worked a lot of odd jobs that tended to be, caretaker, governess, the kind of jobs that women could get at the time. Um, Finally, she kind of took the radical decision to become a writer, which was not easy, right? Not a lot of women were writers, but she did it. She had success at it. She published. Um, she was involved in politics. She witnessed the French Revolution, which we'll talk about a bit later. Was very much impressed by the radical, notions of freedom that were being talked about around this revolution. And she's best known for her book of Vindication of the Rights of Women, which you read some very short passages from, and we'll discuss that book in for a few slides right now. In the passages we read, Wollstonecraft does a lot of sort of complaining about the sort of education women receive. Um, and it's assumed in her society that women get a different sort of education because they're incapable of the same sort of intellect as men, right? And the basis of her argument in these passages is this nature versus nurture sort of argument, right? She says this is all conditioned, right? She thinks that it's society, not nature, that makes women less serious, less scholarly, less talented in the various trades, right? Only suited to marriage and work in the home, right? Um, you'll notice throughout the passages that Wollstonecraft fairly speaks fairly derisively of traditional feminine attributes and values. She seems to think that those are all pretty rotten, and she really kind of wishes women were more masculine in every sense, right? So uh, often not the way feminists necessarily think these days, right? But in a certain, she's reacting to a situation, right? So says, look, our society just trains women to be beautiful and pleasing to men. They're not even allowed to develop their natural abilities, right? If they were, they would be equal to men. Right? She says, yes, of course, on average, women are not as strong as men, right? Um, but she argues that that one difference, right, has been used by men to limit all the women's other abilities, right? Because they're stronger, physically restrain them and keep them in serving men, but intellectually there's no difference. She argues women are perfectly rational, right? And in this respect, right, as opposed to the physical, in no way inferior to men. This is what's happened in our society is that all of the good things about humanity, all the human virtues, have been equated with masculinity, rationality, uh, right, political activity, and industriousness, and so on. And then all the human weaknesses have been equated with femininity. And then the educational system has then just entrenched these, reinforced the roles. Um, so she says, yeah, currently women tend to be inferior to men because they've been trained to be inferior, right? So she says, let's women be more masculine. When we mean all the good stuff, right? Rational and politically engaged. So basically, right, she takes the premises of Locke and just simply explicitly extends them to the other half of humanity, right? Women. If all humans are born free in a state of nature, their liberty can only be limited by their free choice to join a commonwealth, then like why should women be? They're not, you know, the one thing that I don't think Locke says explicitly. It's possible he does because there's um, just implicit and explicit sexism sprinkled all throughout, right? Early modern writing. So I can't say for sure that Locke never says anything, but someone from the time would probably say that all these rights and stuff don't apply to women because they're intellectually inferior. And Wollstonecraft here is saying absolutely not. They're not intellectually inferior. They might appear to be because they've been conditioned by society to appear that way. Not. And if they are not, right, if women are the rational equals of men, then all these rights should apply to them, which means, women should have a free choice. Uh, and if they're allowed these rights and these choices and they don't have their development stunted by a society that wants to limit them to being just companions to men, it'll become obvious that they're equal to men in the industry, all those things. So, far too quick a treatment of Mary Wollstonecraft. I would love to spend more time on her, but hopefully that's enough to get you a taste of the sorts of ideas that are coming around in the 1700s. Uh, Very different, right, than ideas that were around in even ancient Greece, right, where philosophies, sort of Western philosophy began. It would never occur to them that women deserved equal rights, right? Um, uh, Keep this in mind as a backdrop when we get into the French Revolution, the American Revolution later on, and I will see you next time.